This is the video portion of the presentation from week 5, this one being on the subject of divorce as Paul taught in 1 Corinthians. The PowerPoint will be uploaded separately to the discussion forum board. So basically with this subject, and it's in 1 Corinthians, it's in chapter 7. Pretty much 3 principles there, divided by the categories of Christians married to each other, where you have 2 Christians. That's in verses 10 through 11. Christians married to non-Christians, verses 12 through 16. And then sprinkled throughout the remaining verses, we have the concept of trusting God to redeem whatever present situation we are entering into as new Christians, to not drastically change things. And that's in verses 17, 27, and 39. So as far as Christians married to each other, verse 10 says, "To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband." And then in verse 11, "But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife." So married Christians to each other, 2 believers, are not to separate, they're not to divorce. You notice there's a little bit of an inclusio there, where it starts off addressing the wife and then ends that in the second verse with addressing the husband. One saying separate, the other one saying divorce, but the concept is there, kind of in bookend for fashion. And so the thing there is that if for some reason a separation occurs, then there's not to be marriage to someone else. We are to leave the possibility open for reconciliation, and definitely seen that happen, so it is possible. And moving on to Christians married to non-Christians, the preferred approach we see in verses 12 through 14 is, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy." So just because people are unequally yoked before one of them becomes a Christian does not mean that once one of them becomes a Christian that now they're to separate and divorce. If they're able to coexist and cooperate in not only their relationship but in their parenting, and things are peaceful and no one wants to leave, then they need to stay together and work it out. I personally have encountered this myself, where I came to Christ first, my wife did not. Yeah, we went through some rocky times. We did separate. We almost divorced twice, but the Lord, through His grace, kept me on track, carried the kids and I through, and my wife ended up coming around. So, not to say I didn't want a divorce, but thankfully, God helped me to honor this, and the result has been glorious for Him, and definitely beneficial for us as a family. So the children, as it says here, would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So that sanctifying influence of the believing spouse not only affects the unbelieving spouse, but also helps keep the children consecrated unto the Lord as well. Now, the allowed but not the preferred exception is in verses 15 and 16. It says, "But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" And so I think this is really, from what I can see here, is peace is still the also a goal here. We can't just force people to stay together through manipulation or coercion or controlling of any sort. If the unbeliever wants to leave, we are to allow them to have their way in that, and to split up peacefully, hopefully. We don't know whether we'll be able to save the other spouse. Missionary marriages, don't work sometimes, just like missionary dating doesn't work sometimes. As I said, I had to let my wife go, and thankfully the Lord brought her back, but I couldn't fight her on it, or it just would have made things worse. So, moving on to the final principle, and that is trusting God, allowing Him to redeem the situation that, even if it seems hopeless. Verse 17 says, "Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I laid down in all the churches." And then verse 27 says, "Are you married? Do not seek a divorce." In verse 39 it says, "A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord." So to the extent that we can stay in the situation that we were in prior to salvation and allow the Lord to redeem that, we are to do that. We're not to seek a divorce just because we're unequally yoked, after the salvation occurs. And the only exception that really totally lets us out is there in verse 39. If death occurs, then we are free to marry. However, it's got to be to another believer the second time around. Thank you.